On a cold November night in 1542, the most protected man on the planet was dying. He wasn't being killed by a rival king. He wasn't being poisoned by a corrupt general. Instead, 16 teenage girls, armed with nothing but a single piece of silk, were doing what no army in history had ever achieved. They were ending the Son of Heaven. For 2 agonizing minutes, the ruler of 120 million people was a gasping, purple-faced man at the mercy of his own servants. But to understand why these girls chose a guaranteed death sentence over one more day of life, you have to look past the silk ribbon. You have to look at the red lead, the toxic alchemy, and the industrial-scale cruelty of the Forbidden City. This isn't just a story of an assassination. It's a story of a system so broken that mass execution felt like an escape. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. To understand the night of November 27th, we must first understand the location. The Forbidden City in Beijing was not a home. It was a massive, walled-in administrative machine designed to process human lives. Under the Ming Dynasty, this city held between 9,000 and 20,000 women at any given time. These were not just names on a list. They were functional parts of a giant clock. At the very top of this clock sat the empress. Below her were the consorts and the high-ranking concubines. But at the very bottom, where the gears ground the hardest, were the palace maids, the girls like Yang Jinying. These girls entered the system through a process that felt more like a livestock auction than a royal invitation. Every few years, imperial officials would sweep through the Chinese countryside. They were looking for girls between the ages of 13 and 16. The requirements were cold and mathematical. They needed a specific height, a specific skin tone, and a perfect medical history. For a poor family in a southern province like Jiangsu, having a daughter chosen was a tragedy disguised as an honor. Once a girl passed the physical examinations, she was loaded onto a canal boat or a wooden cart. As the gates of the Forbidden City closed behind her, her identity was functionally erased. Her name was replaced by a rank. Her connection to her mother and father was severed. From that moment on, she was the legal property of the emperor. Inside these walls, life was governed by the eunuchs, thousands of castrated men who acted as the palace's internal security force. There were nearly 20,000 eunuchs monitoring every hallway, every conversation, and every breath these women took. You couldn't speak to a friend without a guard recording it. You couldn't send a letter home without it being censored. The atmosphere was one of total, crushing surveillance. Every relationship was transactional. If your friend fell out of favor, you stayed away from her, or you would be punished alongside her. It was a social environment defined by a single, terrifying rule. Your survival depended entirely on your proximity to the emperor. And in 1542, the man at the center of that circle was a man who had lost his mind to a quest for eternal life. The machine was built to last forever. But it was about to meet 16 girls who had nothing left to lose. By the late 1530s, the Jiajing emperor had effectively vanished. He no longer held court. He no longer spoke to his ministers face to face. He had retreated into a world of incense, silk screens, and shadows. The ruler of 120 million people had become a prisoner of his own fear, the fear of death. To combat this, he turned to 2 men who would change the course of Chinese history, Shurao Yuani and Dao Chongwen. These were not doctors or statesmen. They were Taoist masters who claimed they held the key to physical immortality. They convinced the emperor that the human body was a vessel that could be tuned like an instrument to live forever. But this tuning required a fuel, a substance known in the secret court records as red lead. To a modern ear, the name sounds like a simple chemical, but the reality was far more disturbing. Red lead was an alchemical concoction that relied on the biological purity of young women. Specifically, it required the blood of girls who had just reached puberty. The emperor didn't see these girls as human beings. He saw them as biological refineries. Under the direction of the Taoist masters, hundreds of palace maids were forced into a specialized and brutal regimen. Their entire lives were dictated by the production of this immortal fuel. They were put on rigid, controlled diets consisting of toxic herbal preparations designed to manipulate their natural cycles. The goal was to intensify their biological output to maximize the yield for the emperor's alchemists. The physical cost was devastating. The historical sources describe a silent epidemic inside the Forbidden City. Girls suffered from chronic fatigue, severe abdominal hemorrhaging, and organ failure. Because the herbs often contained heavy metals like lead and arsenic, many developed the very symptoms that would eventually kill the emperor himself. If a girl became too ill to produce pure ingredients, she wasn't given medicine. In the eyes of the alchemists, illness was a sign of spiritual decay. She was discarded and replaced by a fresh face from the latest provincial selection. But the cruelty didn't stop at the laboratory. To ensure the purity of the emperor's surroundings, the women were forced into a bizarre and exhausting daily ritual. Every single morning, hours before the sun touched the horizon, during what was called the Third Watch, thousands of women were sent into the imperial gardens. Their task: to collect morning dew. The Taoist priests believed that dew collected from specific plants before dawn held the essence of heaven. The women had to gather it drop by drop. In the winter, Beijing is a frozen wasteland. These girls, dressed in thin silk robes designed for indoor elegance, stood in the biting wind with numb fingers, scraping frost and moisture into porcelain jars. If they didn't collect enough, they were beaten. If they collapsed from the cold, they were punished for their weakness. This went on for years. The emperor sat in his heated chamber, drinking tea laced with toxic metals, while outside, the women who served him were literally freezing to death to provide him with a single cup of water. The Son of Heaven was becoming a monster of consumption. He was consuming the youth, the blood, and the very lives of the women in his palace to buy himself a few more years of existence. He didn't realize that by trying to live forever, he was creating a group of women who had decided that death was the only way out. Inside the Forbidden City, silence was a survival tactic. But in the late autumn of 1542, that silence began to change. Small whispers, passed from one woman to another during the grueling morning dew collections, started to coalesce into a plan. The ringleader was a woman named Yang Jinying. She was not a high-ranking consort with political power or a general with an army. She was a palace maid, someone the emperor likely never even looked at directly. Yang Jinying and 15 other women began to do something that the imperial system was designed to prevent. They organized. To understand the bravery of this, you have to realize that these women lived under 24-hour surveillance by the eunuchs. Every movement was tracked, and every conversation was a risk. Yet, over the course of several weeks, these 16 women mapped out the emperor's life. They studied the guard rotations. They tracked which nights he spent with which consorts. They identified the exact moment when the Son of Heaven was most vulnerable. Their choice of weapon was a testament to their desperation. In the inner palace, metal was forbidden. There were no knives, no daggers, and no poisons available to a common maid. The security protocols were absolute. But the system had a blind spot. It didn't consider a piece of clothing to be a weapon. The women chose a silk ribbon, a decorative, harmless object that was part of their daily attire. On the night of November 27th, the Jijing Emperor was sleeping in the chambers of Consort Cao. This was a tactical choice by the women. The residential quarters had a lighter security presence than the formal administrative halls. The 16 women moved through the shadows of the palace, navigating corridors they had walked 1,000 times. But this time, they weren't carrying tea or silk. They were carrying a death sentence. They entered the chamber while the emperor was in a deep sleep, likely aided by the heavy alchemical sedatives he consumed. They didn't hesitate. In a coordinated rush, they pinned his limbs to the bed. They stuffed a gag into his mouth to drown out the screams of the most powerful man on earth. Yang Jinying looped the silk cord around his neck. For nearly 2 minutes, the hierarchy of the Ming dynasty was inverted. The man who claimed to be a god was being strangled by the teenagers he had treated as disposable tools. His face turned purple. His body convulsed. To the women pulling the cord, it felt like the end of an era. They were doing what no Mongol horde or rebel army had ever done. They were physically destroying the source of their pain. But then, the unthinkable happened. In the darkness and the adrenaline-fueled panic, a knot in the silk ribbon caught. It jammed against itself, refusing to tighten any further. No matter how hard the women pulled, the Son of Heaven continued to draw shallow, ragged breaths. The mechanical failure of a single knot was about to turn a secret assassination into a public massacre. In the suffocating darkness of the Emperor's bedchamber, the air was thick with the smell of incense and the sound of struggling breath. 16 women were pulling on a silk cord with every ounce of their strength, but the knot, the tiny, physical center of their entire rebellion, had jammed. It was a mechanical failure that changed the history of the Ming dynasty. As the seconds ticked by, the adrenaline that had fueled their courage began to turn into cold, paralyzing terror. One of the women, Zhong Jinlian, could no longer bear the weight of what they were doing. Whether it was a sudden realization of the inevitable consequences, a pre-existing fear, or a desperate hope that a confession might buy her life, she broke. She ran. She fled the chamber, leaving her sisters behind, and navigated the labyrinth of the Forbidden City until she reached the quarters of Empress Fang. The Empress did not hesitate. Within minutes, the silence of the residential wing was shattered by the heavy boots of the Imperial Guards. They burst into the chamber to find a scene that looked like a nightmare. The Son of Heaven pinned down by his own maids, his face discolored, his eyes rolled back, and a silk ribbon still looped around his neck. The women were seized. They didn't fight back. There was nowhere to go. The walls of the Forbidden City, which had been their prison for years, were now the walls of their execution chamber. The Jiajing Emperor was unconscious. For hours, court physicians worked over his body, using every alchemical and medical tool at their disposal to bring him back from the threshold of death. When he finally opened his eyes, he didn't speak. He didn't demand justice. He simply retreated further into a state of shock and paranoia. But the machinery of the law didn't need him to speak to begin its work. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in Ming dynasty brutality. The court needed to know if this was a coup. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that 16 lowly women could act alone. They assumed there must be a general, a prince, or a rival faction behind the silk ribbon. The women were subjected to confession extraction, a clinical term for systematic torture. They were beaten, burned, and broken. Yet, the records show a startling consistency in their stories. They didn't name a secret leader. They didn't point to a rival king. They pointed to the red lead. They pointed to the freezing mornings in the garden. They pointed to the fact that their lives had become so miserable that the linkai, the slow slicing of their flesh, felt like a fair trade for the chance to watch the emperor die. The court's response was a display of absolute power. Not only were all 16 women sentenced to the most painful death possible, but the law of collective punishment was triggered. This meant that the crime of these women lived in their blood. Their fathers, their brothers, and their sons were rounded up for execution. Their mothers and sisters were sold into slavery. In the eyes of the Ming law, it wasn't enough to kill the rebels. You had to erase the very DNA that produced them. When the Jiajing Emperor finally succumbed to his elixirs in 1567, the gates of the Forbidden City did not swing open to a new era of freedom. His successor, the Longqing Emperor, did what any sensible ruler would do. He cleaned the house. He arrested the Taoist priests. He executed the corrupt eunuchs who had managed the red lead production, and he stopped the most extreme alchemical experiments. On the surface, it looked like justice. But beneath the surface, the machine remained perfectly intact. The tragedy of the 1542 assassination attempt is not just that the 16 women died, it is that their rebellion changed nothing about the system itself. The selection process continued. Every few years, imperial officials still traveled to the southern provinces. They still measured 13-year-old girls for their height, their skin, and their temperament. Families still wept as their daughters were loaded onto canal boats, knowing they were functionally dead the moment they entered the palace gates. For the next 350 years, through the fall of the Ming and the rise of the Qing dynasty, the Forbidden City remained a laboratory of human isolation. The hierarchy remained absolute. The surveillance by the eunuchs remained constant. Even when the practice of zang, the ritual suicide of concubines upon an emperor's death, was abolished, it was replaced by something arguably more cruel: the Palace of Tranquil Longevity. This was a gilded cage where the women of a deceased emperor were sent to live out their remaining 40 or 50 years in total silence, forgotten by the world, waiting for a death that had already claimed their identities decades prior. Why does the story of Yang Jinying and her 15 sisters matter? It matters because it is one of the few times the property of the emperor spoke back. In the official Ming histories, they are recorded as criminals, as insane or treacherous maids. But when you look at the records of their lives, the freezing mornings, the toxic herbs, the constant beatings, their actions stop looking like madness and start looking like a declaration of humanity. They knew they would be caught. They knew the slow slicing awaited them. They knew their families would be wiped from the earth. And yet, they chose to pull that silk ribbon anyway. They decided that a single minute of holding the emperor's life in their hands was worth more than a lifetime of being treated as an ingredient in a madman's potion. The last emperor of China, Puyi, was not expelled from the Forbidden City until 1924. Only then did the concubine system finally dissolve. For 500 years, hundreds of thousands of women lived and died within those red walls. Most of their names have been lost to time, erased by the very registries that once tracked their movements. The 16 women of 1542 are the exception. Their names survived only because they dared to fail. They remind us that no matter how powerful a system is, and no matter how much it tries to turn human beings into numbers and red lead, there is a point where the human spirit would rather face the blade of an executioner than the silence of the palace. The Son of Heaven thought he was immortal, but in those 2 minutes of gasping for air, he learned he was just a man, and the women he oppressed were the ones who finally forced him to realize it. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.